Hi, everyone. Welcome, Friends of the Planet. Today, I am so excited to be joined by Ryan Fitzpatrick, who is the Director of Climate and Energy at Third Way. Ryan, it is so nice to have you with us today.
Be here. Thanks for having me, Zoe.
I'm so excited to talk with you more about decarbonization. So, as the Director of Climate and Energy, you oversee the organization's decarbonization efforts. Could you explain a little bit more about what decarbonization is and why it's important? Just kind of break it down.
Yeah, good to kind of start with the baseline of how we understand this. So when we talk about decarbonization at Third Way, we have a pretty specific outcome in mind. The science tells us that we need to get to a very specific place. So that's where we're going. Science says we have to get to net zero emissions by mid-century, so 2050. And that's in order to avoid some of the worst damages of climate change. We're already starting to see those, and some of those can't be avoided. But as they accelerate, we have options. And if we want to actually avoid the most or the greatest harmful impact, we have to hit that target. There are a number of different ways you can do it. There are different tools, technologies, and policies. We should be exploring a lot of those, but we can't compromise on that end goal.
Absolutely. I completely agree. So you mentioned that there are a number of different ways that we can decarbonize. I would love to know sort of what those solutions might look like and what's currently being sought out to address those issues.
When we talk about the options that we have to decarbonize, it is important that we look at some of our own behavior. That's a worthwhile goal. So making changes at the personal and household level. However, that's not going to get us emissions reductions at the gigaton scale that we're talking about, which is really
Sounds like a huge
robust.
number.
It is a heavy lift. That's going to require public policy, and that can happen at the local and state level, but it really also has to happen at the federal level. So when we break down maybe some of the most important components of federal policy for decarbonization, I start with things like investment. So investment in infrastructure that will help us build out cleaner options. So things like transmission infrastructure and EV charging infrastructure. And I'd say also, next category would be incentives. So providing things like tax credits and grants that are going to help reduce the cost to consumers or end users of some of these cleaner options once we have that infrastructure in place. And when we do that, we make these options much more accessible, a lot more affordable. And at that point, we can work on a third bucket, which would be setting standards. So that's really identifying where do we want this type of activity or this product or this mode of transportation? What do we want? What do we expect in terms of its emissions output? And let's start setting a federal standard that requires people to get there. And when we've already done those first steps, investing in the infrastructure and the R&D and the innovation, investing in the incentives to bring down costs, we can do that a lot more easily with a lot less disruption to the economy and with a lot less political pushback.
And it sounds like it's a lot easier to understand when ideally the government would set these smaller targets for specific industries than to just say we need to decarbonize. Because I think that, as a consumer of media, that's kind of all I see. But I
Mhm.
appreciate the context in terms of how we can really work this out at, like you said, the state, local, and federal level.
Yep.
So, to kind of piggyback off of that, SEP was supposed to eliminate a huge chunk of emissions within the next 30 years. And that I would love to know sort of what your opinion is on the measures that Democrats are taking to replace it, if they are taking, and how do you think lawmakers can regroup to ensure that we reduce 30% of emissions by 2030?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So CEP or CEPP, this was a system that was designed to provide incentives to utilities or entities that are selling power to customers to sell increasing amounts of clean or carbon-free power. There are a number of other activities and other policies that we can use to help make up for some of that. And it's not going to be one for one. The important part here is, yes, we do have to decarbonize the power sector. We're going to be relying on electrification in order to decarbonize other sectors. So switching over vehicles to electricity or home heating. So we do want that electricity to be clean. But we also do need to get those emissions reductions from every sector. That 2050 goal is economy-wide. So we can't necessarily make all the improvements and gains in just one and then figure out the others later. That's why I think it is really important that we have, in addition to some of the power sector policies that have been enhanced in this bill, such as extending the production tax credit for existing nuclear plants to make sure they stay online. We also have policies that are reaching into other sectors of the economy too. I mean, I do want to come back for 1 second to the nuclear power plant issue, because that is our largest source of carbon-free electricity.
Mhm.
If we lose nuclear plants, we do replace some of that usually with renewables, but in most cases, the majority of that is replaced by fossil fuels.
Mhm.
So, that does eat into the growth that we're seeing in clean electricity. It doesn't help us if we're putting more clean power onto the grid only to replace clean power that's coming off. That
Mhm.
leaves us at best at kind of a neutral zone where we need to be adding clean power. So it's important that you keep your foundation and you build on top of that. Right now, we are seeing a lot of nuclear power plants that are in jeopardy of closing because of financial issues. They're having trouble competing with cheap natural gas and in some cases with lower cost renewables. CEPP was actually a way to help reward those plants for the carbon-free power they produced. Now that that's no longer on the table, at least for now, it is really important to have support from tax credits to make sure that those stay online. The last thing to mention here is when we do see power plants go off, nuclear power plants go up, and we see an increase in generation from things like natural gas plants, that doesn't only hurt climate goals. Those gas plants are going to be producing more power in those communities where they're already existing, which oftentimes are already dealing with pollution issues, in addition to being a source of greenhouse gas emissions. So it really is those communities that end up bearing the brunt when we let these clean power sources go offline. So we have to work at that.
Could you give more context to the idea of nuclear power plants? I don't think that's anything that we have really dived deep into. Maybe that's another interview for another day. But I think when we think of nuclear power plants, we think of destruction because that word nuclear it has such a individual connotation that is very specific. Could you talk a little bit about what they are and how they work?
So nuclear power plants are an extremely reliable and safe way of generating power. We have most well-regarded regulators of safety in the world with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They have been what's kept emissions levels where they are or kept them from accelerating. So we do need to keep the fleet that we have online. We also are developing advanced reactor technologies, which are very far along. They've received well over $1 billion of private financing, and we have multiple companies that are working with the private sector and with government to start planning their first reactors. So those two will be zero emissions facilities. They can work well and be flexible to coordinate with renewables and with storage, with generating clean hydrogen, serving purposes like creating low carbon chemicals or desalinating water. So there are a lot of options. And this is something that they're also really great job creators. So they're long-term consistent jobs, high paying, and they are among the most unionized jobs in the energy sector. So there are a lot of wins, and that's why a lot of countries are looking to this. And the United States is really well positioned to take the lead, given how far along we are in both developing the technologies and in our own regulatory practices.
I really appreciate the context because personally, I don't know anything about what nuclear power plants do, and I'm sure a lot of our readers don't either. So I really appreciate that context.
It's a good segue mentioning nuclear and advanced technologies. One thing that the federal government has been doing, and this has been in a bipartisan way, I think Republicans have not been showing the level of ambition on climate that would meet that definition of decarbonization. The plans they're putting forward are not getting us to that net zero point. One area that they have been willing to advance, I would say, is innovation. So investing, as we said, that was the first bucket of policy, making those investments in innovation. So there have been bipartisan bills over the past 2 or 3 years to develop and expand programs at the Department of Energy to accelerate the research, development, demonstration of these technologies. And then there's a significant amount of funding that would go to these programs that's in the infrastructure bill that Congress is currently considering. And we're talking billions and billions of dollars that could be put toward making sure we can prove out these technologies, bring down the cost, commercialize them, deploy them here, and sell them around the world. We're talking about things like advanced renewables, advanced nuclear, which we were just mentioning, different forms of carbon capture and carbon removal so we can get negative emissions. That's how we get to that net zero. So there's a lot that we can do by making investments in clean energy, and we are seeing that.
In a similar vein, in talking about the infrastructure bill and about Build Back Better, I would love to know sort of a more fun question. If you could give a grade to the industrial policy framework in the Build Back Better Act and in the infrastructure bill, what grade would you give it and why? Sort of thinking more like a grade school type grade.
Yeah, sure. That's a really interesting question. So I would say if it was based on just, is this what we need? Is this everything we need? I'd give it a B minus.
Okay. I feel like that's nice of you.
If it was about, are we doing a significant amount with the limitations that we have? I mean, mostly political limitations that we have in terms of the amount that we would be able to spend or invest, other opportunities to accelerate decarbonization in the industrial sector. I'd say much closer to an A, right? Because we saw the Biden administration really kick into high gear because I think folks were recognizing that this was a sector that, one, it's among the hardest to decarbonize. Certain heavy industries, it's really tricky to actually access and remediate some of these emissions sources. It's a big challenge. It's a costly challenge. And it's one that has pretty significant economic ramifications if you don't do it well. You have commodities that, let's say, chemicals or glass that are sold and traded on pretty thin margins. So they're very competitive. So we have to help our organizations or our industries to make the investments to decarbonize. Otherwise, it could leave them in a precarious position. That's why we do really need to step it up. And so I think the Biden administration recognized that need, and a lot of members of Congress on the Democratic side, and really upped those investments. So at this point, we see an increase in the 48C tax credit. This is basically just providing a tax incentive for making investments in facilities that manufacture clean energy products, but also facilities that are investing to reduce their emissions. We see a huge boost in that. We've seen $4 billion in grants that are going to go to facilities to help them make these significant investments to really scale back on their emissions. This means sometimes buying large equipment or revamping their plant. Very expensive, hard to do. So that's really important. We see the federal government using its procurement power to steer money and support to manufacturers of cleaner products. So the United States, we spend $5 billion each year just on concrete for infrastructure and building projects. So, what this bill is trying to do is start using that money and that investment to reward those or send that signal to the market that we're going to give you an advantage if you can be a lower emitter when you're making these materials. So, there's a lot that we're doing on the industrial sector that is a real step up from where the conversation has been. So I think that's super important. This can't be the last thing that we do. Not in industry, not in power, not in any of the sectors, because unfortunately, it's not going to get us all the way to the end. But it is a really imagine it's like somebody's in a rowboat and you're pushing them off from the shore. This will get them a decent way across the pond, perhaps as much as 50% toward our ultimate 2050 goal, or maybe even more if it's paired with smart implementation and regulations, but it can't be the last thing that we do. We are going to have to row a few more times. It's a really tremendous start and we have to build on it.
That's definitely really encouraging that you gave such a high grade. I think that a lot of people underestimate how complicated policymaking is. And that's something that we've been talking a lot about internally, is really communicating that to our audience and to people in general, is that you can say until you're blue in the face that the government isn't doing anything, but it is a lot more complicated, and your role in that also is very important in terms of advising and investing and things like that. So it's really interesting to kind of get a taste of what that looks like in terms of decarbonization efforts, which I think is really interesting and helpful sort of to build on that. I would love to know what your hopes are for the future, because like I said, a lot of people think, oh, it's all talk.
We have that term net zero again, a commitment made by India, which is among the largest emitters of fast growing population, fast growing industry, major user and producer of coal for power. To hear them setting an ambitious target that gets to net zero is really impressive and encouraging. The majority of the commitments that are made, they're not binding. It's really tough to make them binding. And in part, that's because of countries like the United States. It's been very difficult for some countries to get legislative ratification of these agreements, and they have to go on the commitments that they see from their legislatures already, from their domestic industries, from the populace and what people are calling for and demanding of their politicians. But being in the midst of two massively important and impactful pieces of legislation that could really set the tone for US emissions reduction, for our policies and practice for a decade or more. So that is really important and impressive. What I really want to see is a balance of competition and cooperation. It's not a bad thing when you see countries and domestic industries saying, hey, we do really well. Like for the United States, we have some of the cleanest steel that's produced anywhere in the world. So
wow,
we want to make more of that.
Interesting.
We should be making more of that. We should be buying it ourselves, and we should be encouraging others to buy. We should be working on that in our trade deals. It is really good to see countries stepping up and saying, we're really capable, we're competitive here, or we're investing to be competitive. You see countries around the world that are investing in their domestic EV manufacturing or deployment of EVs. So making sure that infrastructure is in place. And that is something that they see as giving them an economic advantage in those markets where they can have a leveraging point from which to export to the rest of the world. There's also a cooperative element to this, where we will see and we'll continue to see and should collaborative efforts between countries on things like research and development, or trade agreements. There's a way that we can have friendly competition and
Mhm.
also make sure that we're, when we can, not duplicating on each other's efforts. We're taking advantage of some of the headwinds that others are making. I think that some of these side conversations that get into things like trade deals or announcements of new projects, they don't necessarily get as much coverage as the number that's committed to, but they're also really important signals to watch.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the idea of the competition and cooperation. Because I mean, you could look at any technological age in history, and really what drives those innovations is the competition between different countries. So
Right.
I think this is a great opportunity to leverage that idea. And I totally agree. I think that that's definitely going to be something that we should look out for. I'm no
Mhm.
expert, but that's my
You
opinion.
seem
But
to know a lot. And I would say, like it's just that is the mentality that the Biden administration comes into this with. The Biden economic plan was interspersed with climate throughout and clean energy throughout. With that administration and President Biden himself, they do see this as a way not just to do the right thing, but to do really well for the
mhm,
American people, for workers, for industries, and for our economy overall. That's the mentality that we're trying to get everybody into. It's real, it's happening. You just don't want to be the last one to that party.
absolutely. I completely agree. Thank you, Ryan, so much for sitting down with me. I really appreciate it. I'm
Yeah, Zoe, it
excited
was
to
great to meet you.
yeah, great to meet you too. I'm really excited to continue this conversation. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our readers will learn a lot as well.
Excellent. Happy to hear it.
Thank you so much again. I appreciate it.
Bye. Take care.
Thank you.